Now I want to change colors here and argue that by the time we get to the mid-process here of the dates here, this is something you can start to see the beginnings of the development in the early Renaissance, and certainly things are well underway by the time we get to the 1500s. The intellectual revolution, right, occurs, and then by the time we get to the 1700s, institutionally, culture starts to change very dramatically, and there are all kinds of revolutions. And there are revolutions because in historical time they happen relatively quickly. They happen in the scientific world, they happen technologically, they happen economically, they happen politically, and then with respect to any number of other social institutions, by the time we get to the 1700s, we have a very revolutionary century right at work here. Now the 1700s is given the label the Enlightenment by most historians and intellectual historians, and whether we date the Enlightenment to the late 1600s and have it spilling over into the 1800s or so, there's of course lots of room for debate and discussion about where exactly one draws the lines, but nonetheless the 18th century or the 1700s is the age of enlightenment. And so what I want to do is develop a flowchart here that takes these themes philosophically and shows how they play out along a timeline, right, historically speaking. And I want to start by just calling this the Enlightenment vision, which is a label that I think is useful here. And I call it a vision in part because it is taking abstract philosophy and taking some cultural development that had occurred in the 1500s and 1600s, but projecting how this will play out to the extent that those themes are institutionalized culturally along a broad set of areas. And I want to start with the emphasis here that we find in the modern world on reason, that epistemological theme. If we go to the early modern world, we find in philosophers like Francis Bacon in England, and then across the channel René Descartes in France, and then in the next generation John Locke again in England, but a large number, an increasingly large number of intellectuals, what we find is a strong emphasis on reason. There are various accounts of reason that are being worked out by this generation or two of philosophers, but nonetheless what they all have in common is the idea that human beings are creatures of reason. We have a rational capacity, and the most important thing that we should be doing epistemologically is developing our rational capacity. And there are great battles then between the advocates of reason, so conceived, and those who are advocating faith and tradition. And so all of the early conflicts between philosophers and theologians, or between the early scientists and theologians, that is ongoing in the 1500s and in the early 1600s. But what we find, though, is among the intellectuals that by the time we get significantly into the 1600s, it's the arguments for reason that have prevailed, and reason comes to be, institutionalized rather intellectually. Now, if one at a high level of abstraction does two things, if you take seriously, right, the notion that reason is one's way of coming to understand the natural world, then what becomes almost inevitable is that science is going to be developed as an institution. And so in the 1600s, in the early 1600s, as I mentioned here, we have the development of reason, Francis Bacon, René Descartes. By the time we get to the middle part of the 1600s and on into the 1700s, we can see the foundations of modern science being laid. Galileo in the early part of the 1600s, Isaac Newton in the latter part of the 1600s. With them, astronomy and physics are being put on a fundamentally sound scientific footing, and then all of the various other branches of science start to come to be developed. We can see then by the time we get into the 1700s, chemistry coming online, and then biology, right, becoming online. And so we are then developing a naturalistic understanding of the world through physics and astronomy and chemistry and biology, right, and so forth. Now, if we then take that rational scientific understanding and also include our understanding of ourselves, then what is going to start to happen is a scientific understanding, right, of the human being and its ailments and what makes it work effectively, you will see modern medicine, right, coming into existence. And by the time we get to the 1700s, anatomical studies are coming along, physiological studies are coming along. The science of vaccination with Edward Jenner is coming along. Better understanding of nutrition, right, is coming along. And so we have a scientific understanding of what we would then call modern medicine. One other thing that comes out of the development of modern science is the development of technology. As science progresses and we come to understand the cause and effect relationships in the world, it puts us in a position then to manipulate the cause and effect relationships in the world, to develop new kinds of technologies in order to be able to do various sorts of things. If this is going on in the early 1600s and then picking up steam in the late 1600s and on into the 1700s, and then we see science developing starting in the 1600s and again going on into the 1700s, what makes sense is by the time we get to the middle part of the 1700s, we should expect to see some technological improvements. And we did in the early part of the 1700s see agricultural technology changing dramatically, first in England, but then also increasingly on the continent. And then also engineering technology and industrial technology starts to take off, and the dates of the Industrial Revolution usually are dated from around 1750 or so. But certainly by the time we get to 1770 with James Watt's steam engine and the enormous potential that that unleashes, the Industrial Revolution becomes a potent force by the time we get to the middle and latter part of the 1700s. So reason taken seriously leads to science, science leads to modern medicine, science also leads to modern technology, and these are institutions that then transform the world. To the extent that we have better modern medicine, what starts to happen is people's health improves. And one measure of people's health is that they live longer lives, they live lives that are less painful. To the extent that technology comes along, then the amount of stuff, right, that people have, using that technologically, terminological term stuff here, the Industrial Revolution transforms, right, the human productive capacity. Agricultural yields go up dramatically, factory yields go up dramatically, and so people start to have increasing amounts of stuff. And of course, the more stuff there is, the price of that stuff goes down, so a broader number of people are able to enjoy that stuff. All right, and we can certainly see these trends. Human life expectancy numbers start to change in the 1700s and increase as the 1800s go on, and then dramatically in the 20th century, and the same thing occurs. The amount of material goods, the quantity of them, the quality of them improving as the 1800s and then the 1900s go on.